This week we have Savva Kerdemelidis on the show from Crowdfunded Cures. Last week we touched on regenerative finance and carbon offsets with Will Folks. This week we're discussing DeSci. My focus on these areas now is not coincidental. Irrespective of the crypto turmoils, fundamentally we are here for the enabling aspects of encryption technology and blockchain. If there's a value proposition for the leveraging aspects of this technology, ultimately it's not going to be affected by this turmoil. But with it, I did want to put a little bit more focus on the positive public goods use cases for blockchain tech and regenerative finance, as well as DeSci in efforts to reduce patient care costs. There's so much to this episode. You can't come away from it and not realize that innovative incentives for off-patent drugs is desperately needed and could substantially reduce healthcare costs. But why don't we do it? It's not so much that the current system doesn't work, because clinical trials cost a lot of money to build new drugs. But on the flip side, we are not taking sufficient action, and the system doesn't really facilitate seeking to reduce these high costs of healthcare that could be achieved in cheaper ways. There's a lot of complexity to getting this model to work, as well as getting buy-in from the insurance system. It's not that it's failed, but it's become inefficient, and as a result, healthcare costs have been driven up, and it's created perverse incentives in the market. Again, there's a lot to cover here, and it's a very different take from my other episodes, but I think it was important to cover now, and I think you're going to enjoy it. And if you did, of course, please share it. And with that, I bring you Savva from Crowdfunded Cures. Welcome to The Encrypted Economy, a weekly podcast featuring discussions exploring the business, laws, regulation, security, and technologies relating to digital assets and data. I am Eric Hess, founder of Hess Legal Counsel. I've spent decades representing regulated exchanges, broker-dealers, investment advisors, and all manner of fintech companies for all things touching electronic trading, with a focus on new and developing technologies. So today, really excited to have Savva Kerdemelidis on the podcast. Whew, I got through that one. He's the CEO of Crowdfunded Cures and the founder. So Savva, welcome.
Hi, happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Great. So I'm excited to have you. Today we're going to talk about DeSci and what you're doing with Crowdfunded Cures. And I think it's a great time to do it because, right now we're witnessing some carnage in the crypto markets. It's Friday on November the 11th when we're taping this. And needless to say, it's been a very stressful week for those in the digital asset space. But we had planned this in advance, and it's exciting to actually talk about something that touches on public good, particularly at a time where, like, maybe some people would say this week wasn't really so much about public good. Before we get into it, maybe a little bit of background on yourself and what drew you to DeSci.
Yeah, I mean, so my background is I did science actually when at university post-grad. But I realized, and I did law as well, and ended up going to law. I wasn't really that much of a good lawyer, to be honest, but kind of got there in the end, just out of sort of brute force. But I did enjoy science, but I wanted a way to kind of bring those two things together. And then I had the opportunity to do a master's in 2012, bringing those two things together. Particularly, it was brought on by my fiance at the time got sick, and basically going online is when you have a sort of family member or a loved one that's sick. You see a lot of therapies out there being promoted as being effective, but then when you go and look into them, a lot of them don't have a lot of evidence behind them. And typically, these things are things like diets and supplements and off-patent drugs, particularly off-patent repurposing. So you're kind of out there on your own, scrabbling around, trying to find what you can do, what you can take. And I realized that a lot of this was to do with a systemic problem with how science is funded, and particularly what are called unmonopolizable therapies. So therapies where you can't enforce a monopoly price. So repurposing off-patent drugs, supplements, diets, lifestyle interventions. These things can be medically very effective. They're essentially treatment protocols that your doctor might apply, but there's no market to produce those treatment protocols because you can't basically enforce a monopoly price over an off-patent drug or a supplement or a diet or a lifestyle intervention. So that's kind of what led me into Crowdfunded Cures. I set it up as a charity. And one of the ideas is, instead of patents, basically use like a prize-like incentive, and patents versus prizes has been talked about academically for sort of dozens of years. The first prizes actually were sort of hundreds of years ago, the longevity prize for determining, longitude prize rather, for determining longitude, and then other ones, and then X prize more recently. But not a lot around that space. And then during actually my thesis, there was also this kind of talk about pay for success contracts, what they call social impact bonds. So basically a way for funding public goods, getting private entities to fund public goods, whereby if you deliver some public service, you'll get an outcome payment. So one of the areas was prisoner recidivism. So that was in 2012. Basically what happens is usually when people get out of prison, they go back to prison within a year. So it's very expensive for society. And what the UK government did was say, hey, if you can keep a prisoner out of prison for a year, because they found if you can keep them out of prison for a year, then much more less likely to go back, we will give you $10,000 or £10,000. And then similarly, they did a similar thing for homelessness. If you can get a homeless person off the street for a year, we'll give you $10,000. So this whole idea of pay for success and essentially kind of almost creating a new kind of IP. So yeah, sort of on the legal side, my background, I'm a commercial lawyer admitted in New Zealand and Australia, work mainly with technology companies, but also a patent attorney. And but yeah, essentially what I'm interested in is trying to fix gaps in intellectual property incentives. And then where the crypto thing falls into it is that a lot of crypto essentially is about incentive alignment and creating these kind of economic experiments. And you've got programmable money, and you've got ideas like open source bounties and funding public goods. And yeah, I did take a bit of a break, but when COVID came out and people were talking about ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, and all the sort of billions of dollars wasted on clinical trials for that, small clinical trials, where people are still arguing online essentially about whether these things are effective or not, I realized like there's a significant market failure, and this is kind of an opportunity to really try and go and really push crowdfunded cures forward. And then also around that time, there was a movement called DeSci, sort of last year, where a lot of scientists also looking at using crypto to solve a lot of these issues that are facing scientists, particularly the problem of poor reproducibility of science, the idea of like publications getting locked up behind paywalls, and the main one is actually funding, and that's the one that I'm most interested in with crowdfunded cures, is basically empowering scientists to get their research or get their ideas funded so that they can help patients to unlock all of this IP, all of this know-how that's locked inside universities and in the brains of scientists and researchers or whoever, and get those actually out to market to help, particularly to help patients. So that's where crowdfunded cures happen. And I was like, essentially, I was advising one of the biggest, or one of the first kind of DeSci projects, BetaDAO, and that's kind of how I got into it. And we've partnered with them at the moment on this a longevity prize. So looking at BetaDAO focused on longevity and improving healthy longevity. And they have this thing called an IP NFT, which is basically they're using it. This is a mechanism to essentially fund early stage research and get liquidity into researchers at an early stage. You basically mint an NFT and then fund that. But yeah, happy to go into that sort of aspect. Maybe that's a bit much for an intro. And can leave it there. Yeah.
All good. No, let's touch on pharmaceuticals. Certainly in the U.S. and I think in Europe too, in many places of the world have very highly regulated pharmaceutical industries. That obviously creates a very different dynamic when it comes to introducing new drugs and the pressure to generate patients and revenues. The whole value chain is really geared toward these bigger drugs. But I'm talking your book now. So what are some of the market failures that we'll just put it in the category of big pharma has today?
Yeah, I mean, so it's what you say is there is this problem with the entire kind of medical establishment, pharmaceutical biotech establishment is focused on one thing, and they see everything through this lens, which I call a kind of patent lens. Essentially, what the whole business model is around getting a new molecule, and then enforcing a monopoly price over that new molecule. And typically, those molecules are very hard to come by. you've got sort of 10 to 15 years of research before that gets out to patients. And that can, the price that's been, let's just say there's some arguments, but I think it's probably justifiable to say it's around $1 billion to get from an early stage to get a patentable molecule, one that's not going to kill you, one that's going to be effective, and then gets to market. It's sort of 10 to 15 years and $1 billion at least. And then on top of it, then you've got to then make your money back. So there's this real push to market it as much as possible, and to sell as much of it as possible. So everyone's chasing what they call this blockbuster drug model. Essentially, you have a single blockbuster drug, and that could bring in sort of $10 billion worth of revenue over the lifetime of a patent, which might be only 10 years on the market. So that problem is that, yeah, everything is really focused on that side. And I guess the issue is that when you pay for one of these blockbuster drugs, what you're actually paying for is the clinical trials, that research getting it out to market and proving that it's safe and effective in humans. And from a patient and a doctor's perspective, all they really should care about is whether this thing resolves the sickness. And actually, from a patient's perspective, they don't care if they're going to take an off-patent drug or a supplement, or if their doctor tells them they've just got to do these exercises every day. They just want to get better most of the time. And the issue is that the biopharm industry, that whole complex, is fully focused on the only way you can basically get a return on investment, and most of the time, is to actually create a new patentable drug. And if you come to a VC or an investor and say, hey, I've got this off-patent drug or this supplement or this idea that can really save billions of dollars or create billions of dollars worth of value, there's no way of making that money back because of the model, which is really very much focused on the ability to enforce a monopoly price, and typically through the ability to enforce a monopoly price with patents, which are quite hard to obtain. So one of the other issues is that, yeah, if you tell someone your idea, all of a sudden it's not patentable. So it's just there's all these kind of difficulties, and they're actually legal difficulties that get in the way of the actual science. And what we're trying to do, and I think what DeSci is trying to do ultimately, is help fix a lot of these market failures and make it more about, okay, what's the actual, what they call delinkage, where you're delinking the rewards that you get from the sale of a monopoly price drug and linking it more towards, okay, what's the actual health benefit? What's the health outcome that that the public is getting?
Does that filter its way to doctors ultimately as well? Certainly fixing the problem with market incentives also requires practitioners to enforce it. So what is the model for getting practitioners to deliver these alternative drugs? Because I think that's also part of the problem. It's so entrenched. If you go to a doctor these days, you're a hell of a lot more likely to walk away with a prescription for a drug than you are like a vitamin regimen.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and it's all about incentive alignment. I mean, particularly in the private healthcare industry, things are moving in the other direction, particularly in single payer jurisdictions like with NHS and other countries. But say, especially in the US, there's this really perverse incentive where, say, health insurers, particularly health insurers, and even doctors. So doctors are rewarded for services, right, and for doing surgeries and things like that. But what if they could be rewarded for preventing surgeries, or sort of rewarded more for actually keeping people healthier and things like that? So these things are not just, I think, limited to the healthcare industry. It's just the healthcare industry is very unique, where they have this kind of inelastic demand in a way. Like, it's kind of like, you don't care how much it's going to cost you. You get your appendix removed. You just got to get your appendix removed. And so that's the issue. And if you reduced healthcare costs from $4 trillion to $2 trillion, that's like $2 trillion of sales, which are not going into health insurers and or doctors. So there can be these kind of perverse incentives. So one of the ways forwards, and this is kind of where the pay for success financing is coming in, particularly with big payers. They realize, particularly in the States, like 20% of GDP going on to healthcare costs. This is not sustainable, particularly with the aging baby boomer population. So we have to bring those costs down. We have to get more efficient. And so one of those things is this idea of value-based pricing or bundled care, where they basically pay a fixed amount, and then you basically are then incentivized to basically treat as many people and reduce your costs as much as possible, because you are then liable for those costs. So this area of financial innovation, and I think crypto ultimately can be a kind of tool, a useful tool for that, is kind of where things are going. And actually, I believe deep down that a lot of these players, and particularly say with pharmaceuticals, what I wanted to mention. So 2/3 of the new drugs that come out after about 5 or 10 years or however, they end up being found not to be that much more effective than existing drugs, despite billions and billions of dollars getting paid. And so, okay, that's fine. But I think as a scientist, as a person working in a pharma company, pretty depressing, I can imagine. And as a doctor, especially, you didn't come into this, you also kind of want to, I mean, for us maybe as lawyers, we kind of, there's something to be said about client satisfaction. We charge a lot of money, sure, but that's one problem I had when I was growing up and working in law firms, would be charging sort of hundreds of dollars for a letter to this sort of family that couldn't afford it. And you always felt, well, I'm not really adding value. So people, I think that the industry wants to feel like they're really adding value, and at the moment there's this productivity crisis, and scientists at the same time as well, they kind of want to be funded. So hopefully there is some, I think, well, it won't. I don't think it will happen from the inside, but with crypto, I'm quite hopeful that maybe from the outside we can sort of show them how it's done, and then hopefully these things might be adopted.
Let's break down some of the issues with the current U.S. healthcare and pharmaceutical industry. Could apply to a lot of different places, right? The current IP and patent framework, there's certainly a lot of money that goes into getting a patent. But what does DeSci provide with regards to the current patent framework?
So yeah, I mean, the area that I'm interested in, I think DeSci is a lot broader than that. There is other issues around, say, helping with publishing and helping with credentials and verification of data. My main interest is in that exact space around the IP reform and where DeSci can help with IP. So essentially, also one of the things that we're working on within a project called Molecule is this idea of an IP NFT. And this idea kind of comes out of the problem of the valley of death, which is basically this separation, or this valley between, say, university research or research that's on the bench to the bedside, so getting through to patients. And the issue is that a lot of that early stage research just isn't getting funded. And one of the reasons is that, if you do want to get something funded, typically you're at a university, you've got to go to a technology transfer office, and you've got to spin off a company, and then there's got to be like a negotiation. Okay, how much does university get? How much do researchers get? And then they go out and try and raise, and they might raise like millions of dollars to do one experiment, when maybe it was a lot easier. What they really wanted was like 250 grand to do a much smaller experiment. And what happens with IP NFTs, it's like a framework to basically raise money a lot faster. You can basically mint an NFT. You can do something called a research agreement with a particular lab. And under that agreement, it says the data that's generated by that lab is basically owned by the owners of that IP NFT. So, and that's kind of what crypto has done in the past, like say with NFTs, where that represent like land ownership, where the owners of the NFT is linked to like a deed of a land deed, and so all real world objects. So in this case, they're linked to kind of IP, and what that does in theory is it basically lets you then gives you more liquidity. So instead of having to spin off a company, you can just mint this IP NFT, get more liquidity, get more money for your research, and then if you do eventually spin off onto a company, then that IP NFT can go into that company. So that's the kind of more, and that's using the more traditional IP. So eventually that data, if you're a biotech company, that data would basically form the basis of a patent application. That would be a trade secret initially, and then you file a patent application, and then you're sort of away doing the normal kind of raising for a biotech. The area that I'm super interested in is this kind of area where these mechanisms could be used to create another kind of IP, which is a little bit like, again, what I was saying before. It's like the right to receive an outcome payment under a prize for the data. So you have essentially a clinical trial data marketplace where you have buyers that basically say the health insurers, the government will say, look, if you can generate clinical trial data that will save us, $100 million, because you're proving that an off-patent drug works just the same as an expensive drug, or you can reduce hospitalizations by 50% or whatever, then we'll give you X number of dollars. We'll give you 50 million. We'll give you, anything under 100 million should work for them. And we could put that into a smart contract. Basically, it acts like a prize, and then that enables them to pay out that money to the IP NFT owners. And the reason that's exciting is it creates almost like a new kind of IP. All of a sudden, you're monetizing data, and you have this kind of automated royalty. And then you can look at much more sophisticated things. Instead of just pushing one drug on everybody, you can basically monetize an algorithm and a treatment protocol algorithm where you plug in your DNA and your blood tests and whatever the doctor basically decides is your diagnosis, and maybe CT scans, MRI, things like that. And then it can determine like the optimal treatment protocol for you. And that's I think that's where I'm the most excited. Obviously, this doesn't have to happen through crypto, doesn't have to be on chain, but I think having that access to liquidity, then having the IP NFTs being able to be traded on crypto markets in real time, and then having them go up and down in price in real time, things like that, I think, and doing it in a trustless and a transparent way, and also being able to determine ownership in a very trustless way. I think these are non-trivial use cases for crypto. And on top of that, I think the other reason is more the community and philosophy behind a lot of the crypto people. They're very into the idea of open source, of funding medicines as public goods. So there's a lot of incentive alignment, particularly say with psychedelics using off-patent. A lot of psychedelics are off-patent. They're natural chemicals, or they can't be patented. And maybe the active ingredient is like this, this epiphany that you have and things. And so a lot of that is not really amenable. And a lot of psychedelics also, that they have a long-term effect. They could be sort of curative in some ways, or you don't necessarily have to keep taking the psychedelic to get the effect. I know that's not the case necessarily, but that's the kind of dream, is that eventually it will improve plasticity. And so, so psychedelics are very into that, and then longevity. So I think there's a lot of non-trivial use cases. It's not just the hype, DeSci, particularly in that space with IP NFTs. I think there's some really useful, interesting things that we can leverage blockchain technology. And also, healthcare data on chain, things like that. I know there's a lot of issues around HIPAA and GDPR and things with holding healthcare data on an immutable blockchain, potentially, and being able to encrypt that. But that's also another area I think is quite interesting.
Yeah, I mean, we've done some episodes on secure multi-party computation or homomorphic encryption, where like all that data is encrypted, and then secure multi-party computation, you can actually leverage that data, even if it's held by another entity, even arguably competitive, and then you could leverage that data in an anonymized fashion. And then there's even things you can do that go well beyond what we have today with regards to, even managing it at the source that's facilitating it. Like there's something called oblivious RAM, where you get really deep into the secure multi-party level, ensuring that no one can reproduce that data. So some pretty amazing things, but it also potentially facilitates use of data across different applications, like where it may not have been there previously. I find the repurposing of drugs interesting, where you've actually found the scenario where an off-patent drug, which is no longer quite as expensive because pharma's, it's off-patent, everybody can produce it, and it may have properties that are competitive with the ones that are on brand now, and they're the ones that there certainly needs to be competition. I know today you do have choices in some cases to do generic or the brand name, and that actually does take the price of it down. But in other cases, that's the kind of positive outcome you want to sort of encourage, and maybe talk a little bit about like examples of these repurposed drugs that maybe they're not seeing the light of day, but they could also be used generically as well.
Yeah, I mean, and that's sort of, I guess that's a core part of what our IP might be eventually, although obviously this IP is kind of out there, but we do think we have a bunch of low-hanging fruit. There's a bunch of low-hanging fruit out there. And part of the IP would ultimately be, say, the right to say, hey, if we can prove these things work in large clinical trials, then we'll receive an outcome payment, either an advance market commitment from the government or from a large payer, or an outcome payment under like a prize fund. So one of them that we're really excited about is in the psychedelic space. So ketamine has been shown to be one of the most promising new treatments for depression, sort of last 20 years. Ketamine itself is an extremely cheap molecule. It's been around since the 60s, and since the Vietnam War. It's an anesthetic. But what's been shown is that if you give people a sort of sub anesthetic dose of ketamine, they get into sort of almost like a psychedelic state, and this promotes neuroplasticity. And then somehow, I don't really know how, but it actually, people that are suicidal and have treatment-resistant depression, basically gives them gets them back from the ledge and has a long-term mood-boosting effect, which could, in some cases, particularly with multiple doses, last kind of months up to or more. So this is seen as a big breakthrough. But ketamine itself as a molecule is extremely cheap. It's like $2 a dose. However, what a drug company, J&J, did was created a version of ketamine. This is very typical for drug companies. We can talk about this. It's called evergreening. Basically, they do a molecule. They get the old version of the drug and they create a tweaked version of the drug, and they call that S-ketamine. So that's an enantiomer. It's basically the left-handed side molecule of ketamine. And they're charging $850 a dose for this to treat depression. Now, that's fine because they did the clinical trials to put it through. They probably paid a few $100 million or whatever for those clinical trials to put it through. And they would have had to pay more, actually, than if somebody put through ketamine, because this is a different drug. So the FDA would want to know that's safe and effective and things like that. Now, ironically, this is an expensive drug, but randomized controlled trials by independent researchers have shown since then, a systematic review, which is a combination of randomized controlled trials, has shown that actually ketamine potentially is more effective than S-ketamine. So here we have a more expensive drug and a less expensive drug, and the less expensive drug, S-ketamine is an intranasal formulation. It's a little bit different. And ketamine typically is IV or IM. But it's shown that the cheaper formulation of the drug is potentially more effective than the expensive version. So in a perfect world, that should be an arbitrage opportunity. However, because there's no way to capture that arbitrage opportunity, that cost difference, which could save governments billions of dollars, or hundreds of millions at least, there's no way of capturing those cost savings. There is basically a market failure, and the only way you can get around that is through direct public funding, where you've got to pick the winners and basically give someone a grant, and that's not efficient. It's very centralized, and it just doesn't really happen for whatever reason. No one wants to do a $10 million clinical trial on ketamine, even if it could save $100 million. The CMS doesn't want to do that. Charities don't want to do that. It could cost $50 million, but it would make logical sense for them to pay $100 million to somebody that proves that ketamine works, or is just as effective, or if not more effective than S-ketamine. And that's something we're trying to do actively at the moment while engaging with CMS, they run Medicare and Medicaid. It's not having too much progress, but we're trying. And also NHS. S-ketamine, I think it's a great example of this market failure. There's a lot of science behind it, a lot of low-hanging fruit. There's other ones. For COVID particularly, there's a drug called fluvoxamine. Now, people have talked about ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine and things. I'm not going to even go there. But fluvoxamine definitely does work. It's been shown to, well, I can't say definitely anything. So, not medical advice. But in a large clinical trial in Brazil of around 10,000 people, shown to reduce hospitalizations by 90%. And deaths by 90% and hospitalizations by about 30%, which is on par with another drug called molnupiravir, which was one of the first kind of patented therapeutics to come out by Merck, and BARDA, which is a US agency that procures countermeasures, terrorist countermeasures, basically procured $1.2 billion worth of molnupiravir, which is $700 a script. And so they did an advanced purchase commitment, same thing. They said, if you get the FDA approval, we'll purchase it. And the NHS, I think, purchased over $1 billion worth as well. So very expensive drugs, and the same, they're just as effective as the cheap drugs. So another arbitrage opportunity. We're interested in things like low dose. There's another area with this interventional pharmacoeconomics we can talk about a little bit, but where there's a low dose of a very expensive drug is just as effective as the high dose. So this has been shown with Herceptin and nivolumab. I forget which some of one of the mAbs. And the other, I think the dream for us would be ultimately to move beyond even drugs and go into things like diets. So if ketogenic diet could be shown to be just as effective as like Keytruda, which is bringing in $10 billion worth of sales a year, imagine that. But fortunately, no private incentives to fund the data, to generate the data because of this market failure.
What are the barriers that you face? You mentioned you were trying with, I think, one of the agencies, and that didn't seem to advance. Do you think it's a effective lobbying issue? Are there barriers to get that wide-scale adoption to address that market failure? Because like, as you mentioned, there's an inelastic demand. The system is pretty well greased all the way through. Big drug companies, goes to the doctor's office, lunches, whatever, presents all these studies. How does DeSci then take everything that it's produced and effectively monetize? I certainly understand the marketplace, but what are the challenges that you face in having that marketplace respond to it?
Yeah, on the DeSci side, I think, and this is what we need to do, and this is our challenge, is find sources of what we call retroactive funding. So this is people that basically are willing to pay for this data, which is essentially a public good. If we determine the optimal treatment protocol for ketamine that treats depression better than esketamine, and we validate that in large clinical trials, even if we have a product, there's no upside for us anymore. Like, we can't stop people taking off-patent ketamine. So we need some commitment. We need some people to say, hey, if you do this, we will pay you for your product. We'll pay for your open ketamine, or whatever you want to call it, your branded version. And so getting that retroactive funding, getting that commitment, that advanced market commitment, or that prize, is the crucial. That's the barrier, and it's an unusual thing. It's like you got to go to someone and say, hey, look, we want you to pay us for this cheap thing, but really you're paying us for the data. And this data is going to save you a lot more money, or you should want to buy this data because it's going to produce $1 billion worth of value for like a $50 million payment or $100 million payment. But getting them to do that, we need to engage with maybe a management consulting firm to kind of show that, but it's an unusual thing. There's a lot of all of the rails that. And at the same time, those same people will be like, oh, we'll gladly pay you $1 billion for your new drug, which is probably less effective, or we don't even know how effective it is because of, I think it's just institutional inertia. But there are things coming around. So there's this idea of actually the same issue applies. You might have heard about this for antibiotics. So antibiotics have this massive problem. There's this massive healthcare problem with antibiotics, is that nobody wants to make new antibiotics because they work so quickly, and they're usually used in third line, and the less you use them, like, the better they are. So it's like the opposite of the blockbuster model. So you basically have this massive market failure as well. So what they've done with antibiotics, the NHS particularly, this is really recent as well. I think the issue is also that these things are quite new, these ideas. They do a Netflix subscription style payment model where they basically pay you for you produce the drug, and we just pay you £25 million or $25 million a year just for having access to this drug. And it doesn't matter how much volume you sell. And so we basically estimate what's the social value of having this drug, like a lump sum, say $250 million or pounds, and then we just pay you that every over 10 years. And that's like a prize. Essentially, that's what it is. It's a prize for making this drug. And what we want to do is do the same thing, but for off-patent drugs, or these unmonopolizable therapies, or supplements, or diets, or even just data. So that's kind of the reframe. And it's and talking to a lot of these people, they're bureaucrats. They're not going to. The other thing, they're never going to lose their job by doing the same thing last year as they did this year. They're doing the same thing this year as they did last year. So it does require lobbying. It does require a pressure. In the same way that pharmaceutical companies do the same with a lot of the charities. It's a barrier. It's a massive barrier. On top of that, you have these perverse incentives. You have these existing players, particularly private health insurers, which are not incentivized to reduce costs. So a lot of barriers, I think.
Right. I think the superbugs that are antibiotic resistant has been something I think in the last few years, you've seen more of when pharmacies prescribe it and doctors prescribe it for almost any ailment, these variants of bugs or illnesses or, infections that are resistant. So it detracts from the efficacy of that antibiotic over time. So and then you have to give more and more. But it is a perverse model. Like if you're manufacturing it and you're making money off of every single pill, then certainly you want to sell as many pills as you can. But the flip side is that from a public good perspective, it's backwards. So it's that's a perfect example of where the economics sort of run against the actual benefit to the patient.
Well, you can change the economics. So you can change the economics by rewarding. Essentially, it's this area called delinkage. I think there's a website even called delinkage.org, and it's an old idea, and essentially it's the idea of like using a prize type incentive rather than incentivizing people to sell as much product as they can. You basically pay a prize to produce some socially valuable intervention.
And do you think there's a growing acceptance of that, or do you think that the battle still has to be fought?
Well, it's interesting. So I think the winds of change are coming. I think crypto is part of this. There's actually something called the America Competes Act. So X Prize, I think, had a lot of influence, a lot of people that basically they were lobbying a lot, and particularly with Schmidt Futures, I believe that Tom Khalil sort of put me onto this. But McKinsey did this report on using incentive prizes, and now that led to this legislative change called the America Competes Act. And what that allows, I believe, is even $50 to $100 million incentive prizes. The federal agencies can basically authorize and implement up to $50 or $100 million incentive prizes to address, basically to fund public goods and to get the private industry involved in funding public goods and targeting specific bottlenecks. And so we're hoping to leverage, we've done actually a memo for these people, Federation of American Scientists, and they have something called the Day One Project. We've done a memo. This is sort of in progress, and apparently this gets out to the members of Congress and things. But we don't have a big lobbying arm or anything like that. But yeah, I think there is potentially a sea change. A lot of, I think, political, obviously drug pricing was this huge political football. So maybe it's good timing.
Is there a pathway for DeSci to become more mainstream, or do you think it has this sort of element of where it's sort of seen as fringy? Like, how do you see closing that gap? I mean, if you frame, I guess it depends on your audience, and you may not go to every single beneficiary in the space and say, hey, we're DeSci. You might say, hey, we're about crowdfunding cures and research and what have you. But what is the acceptance level? Like when you're talking to government agencies and such, is this a space that they're embracing? Are they giving you sort of a polite hand wave? Are they skeptical but potentially convincible?
Yeah, I mean, to be sure, like when we talk to government and health insurers, we do not mention DeSci, we don't mention crypto. This is nothing to do with it. So that's kind of the thing under the hood and the back end. They don't even need to see that. And it's not really necessary. But with the web, it really depends on your audience. It's been quite surprising. There's a lot of doctors that are really, there's just individuals that are super lit up by the idea of crypto and I guess the hope behind it. And so a lot of scientists, a lot of doctors, a lot of academics, and obviously you have the extreme skeptics as well. With DeSci in particular, it's sort of a broader question, I think, and DeFi and Web3 generally. There is a kind of element of a bit of a culty kind of feel, which people like. They want to be in the in crowd, and I think that's actually creating barriers to adoption. And so a lot of people that are in this particular in crowd, they don't mind that there's high barriers to adoption, because then actually what happens is that people, once they're inside, they feel that kind of okay, now we're part of this thing, and there's this other out there, and we're like on the know, and we're all gonna make it, and these guys aren't gonna make it, basically. And that kind of speaks to the kind of speculative, they call the degen kind of side of things. So from my perspective, I mean, I hope that it does get to adoption, and I think part of that is actually creating some really interesting use cases. And I personally think that this particular thing, funding public goods, medicines as public goods, and science as a public good, is gonna be a very good use case, because it will actually provide real world value, as we're saying, potentially billions of dollars in cost savings, and then create what's called a regenerative model. And to be sure, a lot of people in crypto, particularly in this area called refi, regenerative finance, where they're very focused on climate change, things like that. The idea of carbon credits, right? It's essentially the same sort of thing. You create a market for something, and then through that market, you have you get the private industry involved, and potentially create more upside, and then like a positive feedback loop.
Right. And do you see DeSci as inviting, I guess, I guess, let me frame the question differently. The people who are the most active in this space now, or at least maybe the most influential, has it hit sort of the medical establishment or the insurers or governments? Like, are they coming to to engage in this way?
I think slowly. I mean, definitely. So, for instance, some of the big on the crypto side, some of the biggest kind of pundits or whatever, or like just like Vitalik Buterin, sort of basically founded Ethereum, was probably one of the most famous living people in crypto. He's very much into the idea of longevity, and I think he really likes DeSci and the idea of retroactive public goods funding. He's been spoken positively about VitaDAO. So there's that, and Balaji, who is another, he's well known in that space. He was just on the Lex Friedman podcast as well, talking about DeSci. So starting to get into public consciousness on that side. On the industry side, actually, VitaDAO did just get a 500,000 investment. Well, they bought from Pfizer, bought 500,000 worth of Vita tokens, which was kind of a bit controversial in the community, but apparently they're basically there and providing advice and helping steer things as far as like deal flow. So that's a bit of an endorsement. There's been a few publications in like Nature magazine, and so I think there is quite a bit, because I think the issue is that it's new. The people that are involved are real scientists and very smart people, and also I think probably more importantly, there's a sense of things are not going well. We're not going well, and we need maybe something different, like to help, and ultimately I hope that politicians will get on board.
Interventional pharmacoeconomics. So that's a mouthful. Can you tell us a little bit about what it is and how it fits into DeSci?
Yeah, we're definitely like a branding person. It's a lot of problems.
Pronunciation is a key part of branding, right?
My name, like unmonopolizable therapies. We've got to come up with some better stuff. But crowd-funded cures, I don't know. Even people have said like, what is this about? Like, is it crowdfunding? So we got to think about that. But yeah, interventional pharmacoeconomics. It's actually something I've been talking about it now for last month nonstop. It's very exciting because it's almost like this pay for success prize model, but wrapped into something so tight and around clinical trial design. Where essentially, I was so excited to hear about it. So it's a gentleman, Dr. Daniel Goldstein, who's one of our advisors. He's working with the Eclali, which is one of the biggest payers in Israel, and almost in the world. I think second biggest in the world. And what he does is goes around, as I was saying before, is that you can look at saving money through giving a low dose of a very expensive drug, a cancer drug. And by doing this, I'm amazed by it. It's almost like it's like inventing like cold fusion or something. The problem with clinical trials is that they're expensive. But with these interventional pharmacoeconomic models, what happens is you put half of the people on a very low dose of the drug or a generic drug, let's say the same thing, a very cheap generic drug, and then half of them on the expensive one. And normally you would be giving everyone the expensive treatment. But because you're putting people on the on the low cost dose, and then you're randomizing them doing clinical trial, which is expensive, the cost difference between those two arms can exceed the cost of doing the clinical trial. So basically, you have a clinical trial that pays for itself. And so this is kind of like for us, if we can convince it, we should be able to go to a payer and say, hey, you can do a study comparing ketamine to S-ketamine, and you might be paying $200 million a year to treat 10,000 people with S-ketamine, which costs $20,000 a year. And if we put 5,000 people on ketamine, effectively you're not paying anything, or let's just say it's zero. So you can save $20,000 per patient you put on ketamine, and then that should save you, instead of paying $200 million just by doing this trial, you're now paying $100 million. So you should do this trial, and that's where this is the tricky part, to actually get them to be convinced. I definitely have not had people knocking on my door and asking me to do these things. So there is a problem. There's some disconnect, but hopefully, I think with the right, like maybe a management consulting firm can come in and say, hey, actually, maybe someone might do it. So we're excited about that, because if that clinical trial works, now you can do an advanced market commitment and actually say to them, okay, if ketamine is shown to be equivalent or more effective than ketamine, will you purchase another $100 million from us, from our version of ketamine, or pay for this prize, and so we can get an outcome payment? And then that sort of creates this kind of regenerative model that lets us potentially go to doctors. Because we talked about before this problem with like sales reps going to doctors. It's actually not that bad, because what happens is doctors are busy people, and they might not know the latest research, and so those salespeople, in theory, are meant to educate them, and that's what a good salesperson is supposed to do, right? They're supposed to solve your problem, and so there should be a reason why there's an economic model to actually go out and educate doctors about this, about ketamine and this branded ketamine, let's say, or this new ketogenic diet or whatever. And the other beneficial thing, I think, in particular in a very litigious place like the States, is by having an economic model behind this and being able to create a market incentive to go and take these things to market through FDA. You then have someone to sue if things go wrong. I mean, we don't know. Obviously, the future is uncertain, and maybe ketamine causes urinary problems with people, or maybe there's an addiction element, something like that. And so we need to have that, and so that you have health insurers, malpractice and insurance, and then you have recall insurance and things like that. And that's what insurers are supposed to do. But if you don't have an entity that can be insured and that's responsible for things that go wrong, I think that could be a problematic thing. So that's why, getting into the weeds a little bit, but I definitely think that there is combining interventional pharmacoeconomics with this pay for success model or advanced market commitment model is quite a good, can create a business model for essentially open source medicine.
Awesome. So let's talk a little bit about the economic model from we talked about the degens, the speculators. In a public goods model, you get paid after the fact. You create some kind of instrument, which we'll talk about in a second, where the people who invest upfront, they're locked in for a period of time, and then they could potentially benefit on retroactive funding, assuming it's successful.
Yes, that's what we talk about, the IP NFTs. So we can create that. So there's this difference between retroactive funding and prospective funding. I don't know if these words are made up or not, but these are the words we're using now. Prospective funding is basically the investors, and they're the ones that put the money up front first. And then they're on the hope that if the project works or if they produce the public good, then they'll get retroactive funding. So I guess the degens would be more the prospective funders, although ironically, probably a lot of them, I think my personal view is, but I don't know, everyone's, maybe we're not sure, but these IP NFTs are probably likely to be deemed securities. And so those prospective funders should probably going to be institutional accredited investors rather, so less of the kind of degen types. However, the retroactive funding is actually the most important part, and because that's kind of driving the whole model. And it would be great to get the degens to all pile in on the retroactive side and create this massive $100 million prize for open source psychedelic medicine, or for longevity, open source longevity medicine. And getting those people on board is probably a bit trickier. We're thinking like NFTs, because NFTs, as art, people kind of speculate on NFTs as art. And the idea is that actually, well, there's this idea of a hypercert. We're working on this pilot actually with VitaDAO and Longevity Prize with this other project called hypercerts.xyz, and it was came out of Kevin Iwaki from Gitcoin. They're one of the biggest funders of public goods in the crypto space. I think they've funded over 65 million or 70 million worth of open source software projects. So he's now excited about this idea of hypercerts, which is basically a way of incentivizing people to fund public goods through these things, which are called hypercerts, which traditionally in the effective altruism community called impact certificates. And the idea is that, similarly to this idea of pay for success contracts and social impact bonds, what we talked about before, you could provide incentives for investors to invest in the delivery of public goods, and they'll get some upside out of that. So that's something we're working on now. The issue, I think, is that we don't want hypercerts to be deemed as security. My personal preference is that basically hypercerts are just a certificate of impact that you get as a retroactive funder when you fund something, like you fund the successful clinic, you pay out for the successful clinical trial data that repurposes ketamine, and then you get a hypercert with a number of impact points that is maybe proportional to the improved health outcomes, percentage improvement in health outcomes versus usual care, and that's your number of impact points, and your hypercert is now like a badge that you have, like a trophy. And maybe that there might be some speculative market around that, like a bit like sports trophies and things, but that should be less likely to be deemed as security. And that's kind of where I'm hoping that the degens, whoever can get in on that side and start, instead of buying basically pictures of apes, and which are like $3 billion market cap. So, you'd think that they want to maybe fund open source medicine and be disruptive, and at the same time you can make these as art pieces as well. So you can sort of that's kind of something we're working on now. At the moment, we've got 1,001 NFTs produced by Midjourney, which is an AI tool by he was an algorithmic. He calls himself text expressionist artist, Michael Pierre Price. And so he's made some NFTs for us that we're hoping to sell to raise a retroactive fund for open psychedelic medicine to treat depression.
Awesome. So in the context of, you mentioned some of these things might be securities, and obviously that's a problem when you're trying to fund a small entity. Have you ever thought, in the context of appealing to a crowd, because maybe VCs wouldn't be as compelled, but maybe the community who are excited about this thing they just may not necessarily fit into your traditional instrument. But there is something called crowdfunding. Crowdfunding lets you raise up to $5 million initially with some audited financials, which is not a small sum, and you can do it collectively with other things. But crowdfunding sort of appeals to a very different community, maybe possibly a more civic-minded community, whereas a venture capitalist might be more focused on, how do I make money, right? What's my 10x potential? A community that doesn't get to see these deals all day may be excited about the prospect of being part of something, and you could still also award them NFTs. I'm not pitching, I'm just throwing it out there. What do you think? I'm spitballing.
No, this is great, and you're spitballing and direct, this is the right direction. But to be sure, I think the investors, the accredited investors, are likely to be impact investors. So, we hopefully would be engaging with those kinds of people that are very engaged with a particular, particular field. Like, for instance, VitaDAO is basically like a big fund of VCs, but that's basically run by a community. It's a DAO, and they're very interested in funding longevity research, and and it's actually a non-profit. So they're not so much, they do want some upside, but they're not as 100% motivated as like a VC or something like that. So you've got the impact investors, you've got the crypto kind of funds, but you know, crowdfunding actually, so there's two sides of it, and I think this is actually the retroactive side. The traditional crowdfunding, like a Kickstarter, is actually a little bit like what we're talking about with retroactive funding. In a way, it's like pre-sale. You pre-sell product. You're saying it, and then by using those pre-sales, you're now funding your market, building your market. It's an advanced market commitment. And then there's the equity crowdfunding, which is a little bit more newer, where you're basically then investing in shares and you're getting a share of the company. And obviously with that, yeah, there is you can fit into some exemptions around that. So that's on the prospective funding side. So from our perspective, I mean, we want to use every tool. I think that having a crowdfunding website, traditional crowdfunding website where people can crowdfund on the prospective side, see the price, pre-order the data, and also come in on the IPNFT or prospective side, investor side. I think that makes a lot of sense for future, iteration of the platform.
Something else I want to touch on is social tokens that have reputation associated with it. Does that play a role in DeSci? Because certainly reputation matters within the scientific community. It certainly matters more when you're trying to engage a lot of people sort of in a trustless environment. I'm not sure. I think trust is an important part, but having that reputational component that's validated, maybe if they're engaging in a certain way, that bolsters their reputation that they can take when they interact. So this notion of a decentralized ID, which you take with you. So whatever community you go into, you bring some component of your reputation with you versus necessarily like relying on, I'm on LinkedIn, which could also be gamed. Obviously, you could claim to be the person on LinkedIn, but not. But a decentralized ID could potentially allow you to bring some of that reputation with you. Do those reputational dynamics represent something that has application in the DeSci community, or is that sort of maybe a little more of a stretch?
No, definitely. So for a researcher, basically H-index sort of indicates how much impact you've had, how many citations you've had, things like that. So measure reputation, but there's a lot of issues around that, and particularly a lot of gatekeeping with a lot of the higher impact journals having basically requiring you to pay to publish, particularly like Nature and things like that, on the magazine, and then they don't even do it in the peer review. So there's a lot of issues around that, but we won't go into that. That's publishing. But reputation, I think one of the issues around DeSci and particularly sort of the Web3 community is this idea of but it's kind of a good thing as well. I mean, it's not so relevant, but maybe slightly more relevant with this whole idea of iBresearch. If you fund or if you donate to things, you have a badge, and then that badge can be sort of associated with you to say, hey, I've done this amount of public good, or I've produced this public good, and then that you might get some retroactive rewards in the future from a philanthropist on that basis. So, I think people are definitely talking about this topic, and it is obviously very important for science to ensure that ultimately the data can be trusted, and that you can who's saying where the data sources are coming from, and people that's saying who they are or who they actually are.
Anything that we haven't touched on that maybe we should jump on before we drop off?
No, I mean, I'm happy to talk through a little bit about the system, how it works, just a very brief overview of this medical prize protocol that we're basically doing and how it works, and because I think it's quite a useful protocol that could basically put a price on impact. I think this is one of the trickiest things with impact markets is how do you actually price impact, automatically? How do you create a market mechanism to put a price and to pay the appropriate amount of price, and then on top of it to not just pay the right price, but incentivize people to deliver more impact. So it's a competitive. So you're leveraging the super intelligence of the markets. When capitalism works great, you have these amazing expensive devices, iPhones, whatever, and ideally they should get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper over time, or technology should get better and better and better over time, and that's capitalism working. And what if we could do the same with impact? And that's kind of what we're trying to do with the system. not really sure. I mean, it hasn't really been tested yet, but it's the idea is that you have a sort of prize pool, like a big lump of money, and then say a fixed amount is paid out every year, and it's so 20% is paid out of the prize pool every year, so it never runs out. And so the bigger the prize pool, the more that's paid out every year, and everyone can sort of model that. And the idea is that every year, if you have an IP NFT or you're an IP NFT holder, you can ask an evaluator to validate how much impact points that your IP NFT has generated, and that makes you eligible to receive an outcome payment from that 20% that comes out, split between the number of registered IP NFTs, which at that stage, once there's proof of impact, they would be called hypercerts as well. But let's just keep them as IP NFTs. And then what happens is that creates this market equilibrium whereby, so you might register, say, for 5 years to receive outcome payments of the 20% proportional to the impact points. So if you produce 50 impact points and there's another project that produces 25 impact points, there's another produces 25, you'll get half of that 20%, and the other people will get 25% of that 20%. 25% of the quarter each and a half. And then the idea is that eventually there'll be such a number of IP NFTs registered as that no one else will want to register, unless they think that they can produce a lot more impact points, basically sweep us out. So maybe someone comes along and does 200 impact points, so then they will receive like the super majority of that fund. So there's always that risk of someone coming in and basically out-competing, which is how capitalism should work. But you're pretty secure that if you've got a good amount, that you've got some income stream, some royalty stream. And then what happens after 5 years, you drop off, and then that creates more money that gets available for other people. And so that's the idea. I just wanted to explain through that, and that's kind of the protocol we're trying to build using a smart contract. And we think this could be create basically a way to price impact and maximize impact. Basically, you've got money coming in for some cause that you want, whether that's Indian woman getting a computer science degree or number of trees planted, and this impact prize pool will basically maximize the number of impact points you get out the other end in a very transparent way, and also very decentralized way, and with very minimum moving parts. You just have to have an evaluator that can evaluate impact, as long as the measure of impact is quite robust. Number of trees planted or percentage improvement and health outcomes for a standardized biomarker versus usual care. This thing should be pretty much automated. Just put money in the top and you get impact at the other end.
I remember the name of the website that you evaluate the charity.
Charity Navigator.
Charity Navigator.
There's GiveWell as well. There's GiveWell, I think.
It actually gives metrics, but a lot of people, they donate to a charity, and that's what they look at, and that's their metric, but opens up a whole new community. You can measure it online, you can measure it over time, it can sort of accrue to you, it can actually be something that facilitates your engagement in the community. So it's something that can make, how should I say, more engaged charitable investing.
Well, it's actually, I mean, the ideal of it, problem with charities, you give your money to a charity and then you have to rely on their reputation. But if it's just a protocol and you kind of know you've already prepaid for what you want, and this charity just maximizes the thing that you want, it's basically it's leveraging the super intelligence of the markets. It's like a super intelligence that's like maximizing paper clips, and just maximize the number of whatever the thing that it is you want for the money that you pay in, and without much human involvement in the protocol. That's to me quite. I think that's even better than a charity, because you don't necessarily even have to worry about the reputation. You just have to make sure that the evaluator is evaluating the metrics, and you have metrics that are very robust and very difficult to game.
Yep, I would agree. Hey, listen, if people want to find out more about you, they want to engage, where can they reach out to you? Where can they learn more about the community? And, what are some interesting DAOs? I know you mentioned Molecule. I know you mentioned VitaDAO. Maybe a little bit of the landscape for somebody who's like sort of interested in sort of just learning a lot more about this space.
I believe if you Google DeSci World, I think there's a list of a lot of the projects. Jocelyn Pearl from Ultra Rare, Dr. Jocelyn Pearl. She basically has like a chart that sets out a lot of all of the DeSci projects in the community, which is a great reference. And for us, if you go to crowdfundedcures.org, you can see a bit more information. We've got a landing page there, and then our socials are on the bottom right of the. Definitely sign up to our newsletter. We want to do this open psychedelic medicine NFT drop. Definitely reach out to me, Savva at crowdfundedcures.org. But yeah, we've also got a Discord link, and we've got about 200 people on Discord now. And we talk about things like these examples of these off-patent drugs or called unmonopolizable therapies. We're always posting new examples, sort of coming out every day almost. Yeah, and just happy to get involved, particularly people that are engaged with payers or around financial innovation, value-based pricing. Love to hear from you folks. Anyone involved in the regulatory side around FDA regulations and pharmaceutical reimbursement. Love to hear from you, and anyone that's got contacts and with any of the big three management consulting firms or big four accounting firms that might be able to help us do a feasibility study and convince some of these payers. That would also be super awesome.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much for coming on.